Yes, sir.
Professor Friedman, would you assess the future of freedom and equality based on the consideration that the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission is enforcing an affirmative action program?
Well, I don't believe the so-called affirmative action programs are programs in the direction of either equality or freedom. I think they are programs in the direction of more governmental intervention into our private affairs. I believe that people ought to have equal opportunities to enjoy and use their resources, including the equal opportunities to make such deals of employment contracts with one another as seem appropriate to themselves. I do not believe that it is desirable that we move in the direction of having a government bureaucrat decide whether A may hire B or not, whoever A and B are.
Thank you.
And in consequence, I think programs of this kind are both reducing our freedom and reducing equality. And they will redound to the disadvantage of the very groups it's intended to help. I was citing this morning over here at William & Mary when I was talking to some of the students, a book that I recommend very strongly to all of you by a South African, former South African, he's now in this country, W.H. Hutt, called The Color Bar. And it points out how apartheid in South Africa got started as a result of pressure by trade unions for equal pay for equal work. Again, over and over, we have to look at the actual consequences of policies, not at the names of them. The immediate occasion that we're talking about now, to take the case that seems less tendentious, but is just as important. The equal pay for equal work is a claim for people supposedly for the feminist cause. Now, I believe that's an anti-feminist slogan. It will hurt the feminists. It will not help them. Why? I believe that every individual, man, woman, or child should have an opportunity to get a job if he wants to and can do it. But now, if there are some people who are prejudiced, if Mr. Jones is a male chauvinist, and he would prefer to have a man rather than a woman, or Mr. Smith is a believer in feminine rights and would prefer to have a woman rather than a man, it doesn't matter. But take the male chauvinist pig. If you have a law that he must pay the woman and the man the same, and if he can find some way around having to hire the woman, he gets away free. He doesn't have to pay for his prejudice. On the other hand, suppose he has a prejudice, but we let people compete. Then the woman at least has a weapon of offering to work for less. And he has to pay for his prejudice. The free market, by enabling people to compete openly, is the most effective device that has ever been invented for making people pay for their prejudices, and thus for making it costly for them to exercise it. And what you do when you impose the equal pay for equal work law is that you make the expression of prejudice costless. And as a result, you harm the people you intend to help. Now, you may think this is purely hypothetical. I assure you there have been some careful statistical studies of this kind of phenomenon which show exactly these results. Yes, sir. I guess I'm supposed to go over to here. Yes, sir.
Professor Friedman, you would support equality of opportunity. Is it not a possibility that one of the most effective ways to gain equality of opportunity is to eliminate some of the income disparity? That is, it's a possibility that there is some base level of income that people need to have in order to guarantee opportunity, equality of opportunity. And on this grounds, is this one of the grounds that you would support a negative income tax as perhaps an efficient way of seeing that children have an opportunity to, aren't eliminated from the equality of opportunity?
Well, you've raised a number of issues, all of which are difficult ones, and so I'm going to have to try to answer them simply, and I will not be able to go into the full detail because they are very important issues that you have raised. I think you have to be careful to start out as you start out. I do not believe it is true that a major obstacle to equality of opportunity in the kind of sense in which it has meaning, in the sense of career open to the talents. I do not believe that a major obstacle there is presented by inequality of outcome. It may be it's certainly far more serious obstacles are presented by the fact of the kind of community in which people are born. Equality of opportunity is much more harmed by some people being born in India and some in the United States than by almost any other difference you can think of. So I think that there are many features that are far more important than equality of income, and we want to be careful that in the process of arguing along your way, we don't end up getting the worst of both worlds, of less equality and less of opportunity. Now you went from there to a very different question. So far as a minimum income is concerned for life, I said at the end that I think we want to make a big difference between 90% of us taxing ourselves to help 10% at the very bottom. Eliminating misery and poverty is a very different thing, I think, than promoting redistribution of income in order to get a more equal distribution. I myself support the negative income tax, in fact have urged it, and I think I didn't invent it, but I invented the term. It's an unlovely term, the negative income tax. I'll take full credit for that. I support it, but not primarily for the reason that you say, but for a very different reason. I believe that if we were starting from scratch, if we had an empty, clean slate, private charitable arrangements would be amply effective in protecting, in eliminating real distress and misery. They have been in many circumstances. In our wealthier society, they clearly would be, but we're not starting from scratch. We have a welfare system which, in my opinion, is a mess and does far more harm than good. And the question is, how do you get from there to where you'd like to be? And I see a negative income tax as a device which would enable you to get from where you are to where you'd like to be, while not doing injury to those people whom we have encouraged to become wards of the state. And that's more my justification. Now we come to your final point, the problem of children. And there we do have a very real problem of what do we do about the opportunity of children? The argument for parental control of children is very different than the argument for giving adults freedom. It is that we believe that in our society, in almost any society, parents will have greater interest and greater concern about their children than any other group. We speak of our society as an individual society. It is not. It's a family society. The fundamental unit of our society is a family. It is the interest in the family that gives people an incentive to work, to save, to slave, to make sacrifices. It's the interest in the family that gives parents the incentive to provide their children with better opportunities than they themselves had. So that I believe that primary responsibility in the parent is essential if we're going to maintain a decent society. Indeed, I want to point out to you that every dogmatic proponent of equality has been in favor of destroying the family. If you look at the literature, the really dedicated egalitarians have all protested against the family. They want to get the children out of the home at an early age, put them into community nurseries, raise them all the same, and so on. Why? Because the family is the true cement of the society. It's the true unit. So, and yet, I agree that when it comes to it, we cannot avoid having to say, in the case of parents who neglect or mistreat or do not provide their children with some opportunity, we must retain as a final resort on the part of the state the right to step in as surrogate parents. Now, I think that we should not defend that in terms of equality, but we should defend that much more in Thomas Jefferson terms, in terms of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of every individual. Thank you.
Yes,
sir.
Dr. Freeman. I have two short questions. National Review.
I hope they permit short answers.
Last week's National Review ran an article on the income tax rates in the United States in which they said that the top 50% of the taxpayers in the U.S. are paying 92 or 93% of the total taxes. I'd like you to comment on that. And also, has anyone ever done a study as to the volume of and the effect of counterfeiting on the money supply?
The second question I can answer very quickly, no. No way you can do it. The successful counterfeiter you're never going to catch. Of course, the biggest counterfeit of all is you and me, in our capacity as citizens, instructing our fellows down in Washington to turn that printing press. There's a real counterfeiting. And we have done studies of that, legal counterfeiting. But illegal counterfeiting, no. On the first question, there is no doubt that our current personal income tax is highly graduated, and that people with high incomes on the average contribute a lot larger fraction of total taxes than people with low incomes. No doubt. But those figures are extremely misleading because they understate the burden on upper income classes. Why? Because they deal with the money paid over to the government. But part of the cost of the tax system are the costs that people incur in order not to pay money to the taxpayers. We have thousands of high-paid accountants and lawyers who would be in different professions if it were not for the fact that there are the kinds of income taxes that there are now. There is no difficulty in knowing how to cut tax rates while letting the government have more revenue and letting people pay less. My favorite scheme, which hasn't got a chance of a snowball in the nether regions of being adopted, my favorite scheme is simply to leave the income tax law just where it is, but make the highest rate 25% instead of going up to the 70% it now goes up to. You won't, don't say that, because you will not bring the appropriate political pressure on your congressman to pass it. Now that simple change, why would that, you ask me, how can it be lowering rates will give more revenue? The answer is very simple. At a 25% top rate, it wouldn't pay people to spend the amount of money they now pay to get around paying taxes. Why pay 50 cents on a dollar for a tax shelter if it's only going to save you 25 cents in taxes? Over and above the revenue which the government gets, there is an enormous cost to taxpayers of compliance. By substituting a top rate of 25% for the present top rate, I can guarantee you that anybody who will sit down with me for 15 minutes with the numbers will be persuaded that the government would take in more revenue. No other change in the law, and yet there isn't a chance of passing it. Why? Because if you passed it, what would the congressman have to sell? What would tax lawyers and accountants have to sell? You may think that's a joke. It isn't. It's serious, and it's a real reason you won't get it done. Thank you.
Yes, Professor. Would it be wise for the U.S. to reduce or eliminate its national debt, or better to keep it at a fixed percentage of the gross national product, on average varying the percentage temporarily during periods the economy needs to be stimulated or dampened?
Well, you've asked two different questions. First place, we have been reducing sharply the ratio of the national debt to national income. The national debt is decidedly lower today than it was 40 years ago, 30 years ago. How has that been achieved? How can it be that every year we've run deficits and yet the national debt goes down as a percentage of income? Because we've been paying off the debt with funny money. We've been paying it off through inflation. And we've been inflating the income level while the funded national debt, we have been selling government securities and government bonds to people and making them pay for the privilege of lending to the government. I never tire of pointing out that the government savings bonds and government long-term bonds have been a snare and a delusion to anybody who has been foolish enough to buy them, that people buy them and get back in purchasing power less than what they originally paid for them, and to add insult to injury, have to pay taxes on the alleged interest that they receive. So that's what... That's how we've been paying off the national debt. Now, however, that's really misleading, because that's not what the national debt really is. That's the funded national debt that you're referring to. We also have an unfunded national debt. That is to say, the U.S. government, particularly under Social Security, but also under various other future promises, railroad retirement, civil service pensions and the like, has promised to make payments in the future to a far greater extent than the taxes which those same programs are now scheduled to yield. The unfunded debt of that kind now has a present value of something between $1.5 and $3 or $4 trillion. It's many times the size of the funded debt. Now, you ask the question, should we keep that at a constant fraction ratio of GNP? It doesn't really make too much difference, in my opinion. I believe that on the whole it would be best to have a system under which, over a reasonable period of time, we tended to have a balance between government expenditures and government receipts, so we did not add to the national debt. Then at least we should hold it constant, not as a percentage of the GNP, but constant. That would, in my opinion, be the best, but I'm not sure it's very feasible. But then you said, except to manipulate it from time to time as a way of stimulating the economy. But that isn't a way of stimulating the economy. That, again, I can't get into that, but you are implicitly assuming something there which is very far from being acceptable. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, it's my view that equality of opportunity to a large extent depends upon the freedom of the individual to do as he chooses within the confines of our law. And within the past 50 years or so, it seems as though the government is taking a larger role in our lives, regulating more and more, or if you will, taking on more and more the characteristics of a welfare state. And what I was wondering is, as people become more dependent upon the government for benefits, they tend to lose their freedom of choice. Assuming this trend will continue, what do you see in the future to protect the individual liberties of our people?
Well, the greatest protection of the individual liberties of our people, fortunately, is the extraordinary ingenuity that they are able to display in getting around these regulations and controls. The fact is that the number of individual citizens is very much greater still than the number of bureaucrats trying to enforce these regulations. That the citizens have a stronger interest in avoiding the regulations than the bureaucrats have in enforcing them. And as long as that situation continues, we'll have a reasonable degree of freedom. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, relative to your monetarist theory, allegedly, John Kenneth Galbraith has said that yours is the best of all economic theories. One, because it can't be proven wrong, because it hasn't been tried. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I wish I could accept John Kenneth Galbraith's encomium. I hope it's true, but if it is, it isn't for the reasons he's giving. Of course it's been tried. There's a great confusion in this area. What we are asking a question is whether certain relationships that are asserted to hold do hold. The theory does not consist of a prescription for a particular course of action. What he is referring to is the prescription which I have over and over again suggested, which is that government should conduct its monetary policy so as to produce a steady rate of growth in the quantity of money. That's a prescription. But it rests on a theory which has to do with the relationship between monetary quantities, monetary aggregates, total money supply, and other magnitudes. And that theory has certainly been tried over and over and over again. There's no problem of examples in which it's been tried. I'll illustrate a case which was not very far from here. In the Civil War, in the war between the states, as I guess you people here would refer to it, in the war between the states, the South, the Confederacy, financed the war primarily by printing money, and you had a very nice inflation running here, something like 4% a month, as a way of financing the war. At one point late in the war, the Northern armies overran the places where the printing presses were. And it took them about 3 weeks to move the printing presses to a new location. In the meantime, they couldn't print any more pieces of paper, and lo and behold, the inflation stopped. Well, now that's a pretty good trial of the theory, isn't it? And there are thousands of trials of that kind. There's an enormous amount of evidence that has been accumulated about the kind of relationships that underlie that theory. And so it simply is not valid to say that the theoretical relationships have not been tried. What is true is that the policy prescription has not been tried.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Friedman, I'd like first to thank you for the opportunity to approach you. And I'll ask this question. Although I'm largely in favor of the free enterprise system, I'm rather troubled by the broadcast industry, particularly television. It's quite good at doing what free enterprise does so well. It pleases the masses. But it would seem to do so at the expense of creating a lot of, I think, generally undesirable social connotations. Here it seems the free enterprise system breaks down. What's your reaction?
Not at all. What breaks down is that the free enterprise system is not allowed to operate in television. I agree with the criticisms you make of television and radio, but we have to ask why. And the answer is because we do not have a free enterprise television and radio system. We have a government-controlled radio and television system. You cannot broadcast over the airwaves unless you get a license from the Federal Communications Commission. You cannot keep that license unless you accept the rules and regulations which the Federal Communications Commission lays down on you. The Federal Communications Commission has decreed that advertisers shall get special privilege over TV and radio. And in effect, they have subsidized in this way, in large mass, the advertising industry. I am in favor of a free enterprise radio and television system. What do I mean by that? I believe that the U.S. government should hold an auction. It should auction off the rights to television and radio channels, converted into private property. Here is a certificate, and just as you have a deed entitling you to a certain piece of land, so you would have a certificate entitling you to ownership over the right to broadcast at such and such a frequency, such and such a power, between such and such hours, from such and such place. Now, once you had that, it would be private property. You could recombine it with other people. You could buy some other people's rights to get a broader channel. You could switch yours for somebody else, just as you can recombine land. Moreover, once you did that and auctioned them off and sold them off, you could then abolish the FCC. And you could then have a radio and a TV system that would be just as free and just as open as the print media are now. The reason you have the problems you mention in radio and TV is because the Federal Communications Commission has prevented for decades the development of systems of pay TV, of arrangements for providing television and radio programs under a means whereby the listener or the viewer paid directly for what he saw or heard, and therefore in which the customer had something to say. Today, any viewer who is not influenced by advertising has nothing to say about the kind of programs he sees. If you want to see if you want to see the difference between a true free enterprise system and a fake system which is controlled by the government, let your imagination run to what would happen to the print media if you use the same principles there that you use on radio and TV. Suppose you were to pass a law saying that no printed matter can be distributed except free of charge, that you cannot charge anybody for print media. Now today you have print media, some of which is distributed free of charge, neighborhood advertising newspapers and the like, propaganda pamphlets, party platforms. You also have print media in which there's a lot of advertising and maybe what you pay for it is half of what it costs to produce. You also have print media in which you pay the whole cost, books and the like. So if everything had to be distributed away free, it would all have to be financed by advertising, and you would have the same kind of wasteland in print media that you now have in television and radio. Because the only kind of thing that would pay people to distribute with advertising would be things which had a mass market and which were very cheap. So the problem in radio and television is not that free enterprise isn't producing what we would expect of it. It is that we don't permit free enterprise to operate. Now that monopoly, that situation is going to be broken. It's going to be broken, in my opinion, by the entrance of the cassette recorder, the Betamax and the like, under which it will be possible to have libraries of video cassettes that can be rented out and sold out, and that's going to enable you for the first time to make effective use of this medium.
Okay,
it's all right, just say it over.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I find the idea that paying a group lower wages is a way to make an employer pay for his prejudices unclear. His implied payment is a degree of discomfort, which it would seem becomes manageable in view of the higher profits afforded. Could you clarify?
Of course, I'll be glad to. He doesn't get any higher profits. He gets driven out of business if he insists on behaving the way you're talking about. Because there'll be some other fellow there who will be willing to take advantage of those people who are available. And that other fellow will be able to undercut the first fellow. Most employers who discriminate on irrelevant grounds are not expressing their own tastes. They're transmitting the tastes of their customers. An employer who deliberately chooses less productive people or more expensive people in place of less productive because he has tastes in that way is going to be at a competitive disadvantage in the market. His costs will be higher than the other fellow's costs. And as a result, he will tend to be driven out of business.
I don't mean to imply he would employ less competent workers. The workers might be equally as competent. They're women or blacks or any other group that works for lower wages.
But if they work for lower wages and he refuses to hire them, I mean, go back. Let's see what's involved. If they're equally competent, then other people will have an incentive to hire them away and pay them higher wages, won't they? Unless everybody shares the prejudice. If there is anybody who's unprejudiced, they can hire them away and do a better job. But suppose for a moment that they're not equally competent. Suppose they really aren't as productive. Then whom are you benefiting by forcing him to pay them the same wages? You're hurting them, you're hurting him. He's going to be out of business, they're going to be out of jobs. Now, how do we know which are equally competent or not? How do we decide that? You're back in the dilemma that who's going to make the judgment? In a free market, we each make our own judgment, and if we don't interfere with it, anybody who lets irrelevant considerations enter in is going to pay for it. Because he won't be hiring the most efficient, the most competent, the cheapest groups. Let me go back to some stories along these lines that are interesting. At a time when there was great prejudice on the part of whites to be served by blacks in retail stores, take a case like that. A storekeeper who insisted on hiring blacks would simply go out of business as customers would leave them. At that time, what happened? Businessmen tried to arrange things so as to have as few people in front as possible and as many people behind the back as possible. And you had them using the blacks who were disadvantaged behind because that was a cheaper thing to do. They were working their hardest to eliminate the effects of prejudice. Now, if you say they've got to pay the same price to everybody, regardless of anything, there's no incentive on them to work hard to remove the effects of prejudice. Thank you. That's a good point at which to quit.